Good evening, everyone. I think it's perhaps a troubling time to be talking about this subject, but the events of the day, of the past month, perhaps 6 weeks, requires us all, I think, to rethink how we stand in the Middle East. So tonight I'd like to talk about the three threats to the United States that emanate from the Persian Gulf: Iran, Saudi Arabia, and what I call Al-Qaedaism. In speaking tonight about the Persian Gulf and our war against the Islamist militancy emanating from there, I want to start with words George Washington used to describe the new national government's responsibility to ensure that Americans clearly understand the threats they face at home and abroad. I am sure that the mass of citizens of these United States mean well, Washington told John Jay in 1796. And I believe that they will always act well whenever they can obtain a right understanding of matters. Let me say that I share Washington's faith in the essentially sound common sense of Americans, except perhaps that of the coming generation, whose male members seem unable to figure out how to put a baseball cap on so the brim points forward. But I am not sanguine that our national government, under either party, is capable or even desirous of accurately educating the citizenry about the Islamist threat confronting America. Today, Americans simply do not have what Washington called a right understanding of the threats from the Persian Gulf region. In my writings, I have sought to acquaint Americans with the nature of these threats, whether from Iran and its co-religionists in Iraq and Lebanon, the vicious, martial, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, and anti-Western brand of Islamic theology exported under Saudi Arabia's official imprimatur, or the forces Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and other Sunni Islamists lead and incite. And I also argue that the United States government, under both parties, is fighting an Islamist enemy that does not exist, and therefore it is employing policies that run counter to America's historical traditions and so to its best interests. Official Washington's Islamic enemy is the stuff of Hollywood farce. Be they Shia or Sunni, the Islamists are a limited band of fanatic nihilists, ready to kill widely and indiscriminately for the pure joy of murdering, and ready to sacrifice their lives because my daughters go to university, Iowans hold early presidential primaries every 4 years, and because I, may God forgive me, have one or more Sam Adams after work. Would that such an enemy existed, for he would be at most a lethal nuisance and not the national security threat posed today to lesser or greater degree by Iran, the Saudis' Islamic imperialism, and the Sunni Islamist movement symbolized and inspired by Osama bin Laden. This farcical view of America's Islamist enemy is unfortunately endemic in both U.S. political parties, much of the U.S. and Western media, and perhaps most damaging, much of the academy, especially in our most prestigious universities. It is in my judgment that this view is almost entirely without substantiation. And if it continues to be Washington's working assumption, America will slowly but surely be defeated through the loss of prestige, blood, financial solvency, and domestic political cohesion. We will lose not because any of these threats are stronger than we are. That certainly is not the case. America's myopic governing elite and its media acolytes have taken enemies who are each in military capability, at most a puny 5 foot tall, even in jack-booted sandals, and made them into 10 foot tall and still growing behemoths. The three threats I'm going to speak about are those posed by Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Al-Qaeda and its allies. Taking these three threats, each of which is based in the Persian Gulf, let us first look at the smallest, least threatening threat, that which comes from Iran. Since our Tehran embassy was seized in 1979 and America was humiliated for more than 400 days, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been the bête noire of the bipartisan U.S. governing elite. The hostage holding created a hatred for Iran among ordinary Americans that is easily exploited by U.S. politicians, journalists, academics, and pro-Israel organizations. So successful have these scaremongers been in hyping what they often call a Nazi-like Iranian threat, in fact, that in all of American history, there probably has not been a non-threat like Iran that has been more feared by the average American. Look at Iran and what do you see? First, we see a relatively small island of Shia Muslims surrounded by a Sunni world that despises them and would rather kill them than all the Americans, Britons, or Israelis they can get their hands on. Second, we see an Iran that in the last decade has been virtually surrounded by U.S. military bases and knows that its access to the high seas can be shut almost instantly by the U.S. Navy. And third, we see an Iran whose energy production has peaked and, with the economy it supports, is steadily declining. In Cold War terms, then, Iran is fully contained by opposing powers. But then again, so was Iraq, and that did not stop an unnecessary, disastrous war. Ah, you might say, but what if Iran gets a nuclear weapon? My answer is there is no if about it. Iran will get a nuclear capability. If we had been serious about stopping it, we would have stopped our European allies from selling Iran the necessary elementary technology in the 1990s. The Iranian leadership, moreover, has heard nothing from Washington, Israel, and much of NATO for the past 20 years, except threats of regime change and preemptive strikes, has experienced little but the reality of UN sanctions, and most recently has seen more than 400 US congressmen and senators turning on their own president by standing and cheering a 2010 speech in Washington by Benjamin Netanyahu calling for war in Iran, on Iran. It has also seen, as we're seeing today in Egypt, Western governments encourage their nice, safe, and politically naive college students to Twitter young Iranians to urge a political revolution without a care about how many of those Iranians would die in the streets as a result. Given this context, in terms of political reality, Iran's leaders would be truly negligent if they were not seeking an effective defense against the constant threats from the world's most militarily potent nations. So Tehran will certainly get a nuclear weapon. But then what? Well, my response would be to ask, so what? Iran does not have the ability to hit the United States with such a weapon, while we certainly can incinerate Persia. And the Shias will not supply it to Sunni extremists who would be more likely to use it against Iran than against the West. But will they not use it against Israel, you ask? And I would say only if Iranian leaders are the most stupid men and women Allah ever created. Israel possesses a large, multifaceted, and wholly unaccounted for WMD arsenal, and it would surely use it if Tehran looked like it was even remotely thinking about a first strike. Indeed, Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons still leaves it a Shia island surrounded by hostile Sunnis, U.S. military bases, and U.S. and Israeli nuclear targeteers focused squarely on it. In other words, with or without a nuclear weapon, Iran is contained. It can continue to dabble with its violent surrogates in the Israel-Muslim religious war, but it cannot pose a military threat to the United States. Before moving to our so-called Saudi friends, let me say that there is one serious Iranian threat to the United States, but only if we and/or the Israelis strike Iran first. Thanks to more than 35 years of near criminal negligence by the U.S. executive and legislative branches in the areas of border control and domestic security, both Iran and its Lebanese Hezbollah surrogate have created a large clandestine infrastructure in the continental United States, one which works with similar networks in Canada, Mexico, and the Caribbean. The Iranians are too smart and too afraid of U.S. military power to use this network to strike first in America. But it clearly is designed to allow Tehran to respond with violence here if Iran is attacked by the United States or by our Israeli allies. Now for Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf Arab tyrannies that govern the states adjacent to what we too often forget is referred to by the Sunni world as the Arabian Gulf. Let me first say that I view Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser degree its fellow Arab Peninsula tyrannies, as the nation state that is perhaps the most dangerous to the United States and to the West generally.